come to Psalm 42 and a little bit of Psalm 43. And this is really, for me, a high point of biblical poetry. Again, my day job was professor of English literature, so you're going to get some of this from me. High point of biblical poetry, and it greets us right in the very first verse. And I'll read it from another version. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. This hardly needs any commentary, though of course I'm going to go on for another 20 minutes or so. But like all good poetry, it articulates something that's just so basic to our body and soul, so instantly recognizable. We know it. This image of longing, desire, yearning, of thirst, yeah? The doe, the deer in her fragility, in her vulnerability, no doubt pictured in the dry desert terrain of Palestine, is longing for water. It's an image we find in other ancient literature, by the way, even apart from the Psalms, and certainly this line, at least, has inspired a lot of poetry since this psalm was written, including this poem from contemporary British poet Malcolm Guite. Listen to this. You are my heart's desire from first to last, like as the heart, H-A-R-T, desires the water brooks. So my soul longs towards you, so I thirst for living streams, not for the dusty books they write about you, nor the empty words that ring from pulpits, nor the haughty looks of those who market you. These are the shards of broken idols. I long for the deep in you that calls to the deep in me. The chords that sound those depths and summon me to weep at first with tears of grief and then with tears of joy, that I may sow these tears and reap a timeless harvest, that the ripened ears of grain may shine as clean and clear as gold, shucked of the husk of all my wasted years. You are my heart's desire, writes Guite, a clever homonym, right? You know what a homonym is? Two words that sound the same but are actually different. Flower. What did you think of? The thing that grows in your garden or the thing you make bread with? Flower, that's a homonym. Two words that sound the same. Guide opens here with this homonym, you are my heart's desire. In the text it's spelled H-E-A-R-T, the thing that beats in our chest. But of course, heart, H-A-R-T, is another name for deer. So yes, Guide says, you are our heart's desire, but you are also the desire of that deer in us, that thirsty deer, that heart, H-A-R-T, that longs for God. In Guide's poem, as in the psalmist here of 42, what is the thirst? It's a desire for presence, for someone offering waters of life, not an idol that is fragile and breaks, or I guess in our world, a celebrity that we discover is broken. Rather, someone whose depths can know our depths, who does not retreat at our tears, but who rejoices in our joy, and whose waters ripen us into flourishing and fruitfulness, or in Guite's words, that produces grain in us that shines as clean and clear as gold, shucked of the husk of all my wasted years. The psalmist's opening line resonates, I think, with us, or has with many at least, because we humans know a lot about desire, right? We know it in our deep. We don't just know it from dusty books, as Guide says. We know it in our bones, right? Desire is imprinted in our depths. Desire goes all the way down in us, into the heart. which, by the way, the heart in the scriptures is a high and deep and broad place. You know, to the question, what does it mean to be human? There are several answers. Frequently, we believe, many would say what it means to be human is our rationality, right? Our ability to think, our practical reason, our ingenuity, our cleverness that separates us from the animals, and that is even the mark of the image of God in us, and I think that's right. Others would say it's our relationality, not our rationality chiefly, but our relationality, our need for interpersonal relationships at a more complex level than those simply of the herd. We looked last week in Psalm 31, or I think that was 2 weeks ago, at the psalmist's desire. I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. So some would say, yeah, what it means to be human is chiefly that we are made for relationship. And that's certainly true. But surely part of what we are is that we are desiring creatures, right? We thirst not just for water, but for relationship, yes, relationship chiefly, but also for meaning, for beauty, for goodness. We are desiring creatures. The Christian philosopher James K.A. Smith has worked hard in his books to remind us that we are not just, as he calls it, thinking thingisms. We're not just brains on a stick, but that we are teleological, which is a fancy philosophical and theological word that means all the way down, we're driven from the heart by visions of the good life that we desire, by teloi, or things that we move toward. We're not just cool and detached, making rational decisions. Our life is guided by compelling images, pictures, visions of the good life, what we would like to be. Imagination is that strange combination of rationality and desire, isn't it? And that's what drives our lives. Our desires, good or ill. Dallas Willard used to consistently have a little acronym he used for the spiritual disciplines. He called it VIM, V-I-M, vision, intention, means. To do a spiritual discipline, you have to have vision, a picture of it, intention, the desire to do it, and then some means or understanding how to do it. But notice that even for him, vision comes first. A compelling picture of the kind of people we're called to be in God. A vision of the good life in God, which then produces a longing necessary for us to even carry out those things. These days I work out with a trainer, a gift from my brother who bought a number of sessions but was unable to use them. And he's a young man who was raised in a different faith, and he knows that I'm a college pastor, and he actually knew this week when I was training with him that I was teaching in my church. And he asked me what I was teaching on. And I said, well, I'm put on the spot for a summary. I hadn't quite gotten it through yet. And I said, well, I'm teaching Psalm 42. And he says, well, what's that about? I said, well, it's about desire. And it's about the desire for God. And so somewhere between the shoulder press and the bicep curl, he actually asked me, in kind of a departure from our other conversations, he says this, what do you think comes first, he asks me, persistence or a dream? And so we had a little philosophical conversation right there at the weight bench while I was doing reps, and he was just sitting there. And he agreed with me that, yeah, a vision has to come first, some type of picture, he called it a dream, had to be present and frequently renewed because it's hard to persist in anything without a compelling vision of where you're going. I asked him what his compelling vision was for his life. And he told me, which was nice. His vision of the good life was pretty material through and through. And so then I asked him, I think we were doing chest flies at this point. I asked him, is God necessary for your vision of the good life? And that threw him off a little bit, as if he hadn't figured God in yet, but to leave God out suddenly made his vision of the good life feel kind of thin and weak. He told me he doesn't have very many people to talk to this way about these things, and he thanked me for being a good listener. And then he said, drop and give me 20. So, But visions of the good life come in all forms, right? And should the topic come up at a gym or any other place, it's often interesting to ask people, what's your vision of the good life? Because everyone has one, and many times it's competing ones that they carry with them. Many things come up. I mean, they might be populated with images of food or beaches or beverages and hammocks, and I'm certainly not going to throw stones at that, enjoying those as I do. Though as an ultimate end, that can be kind of dull in the long run. James K.A. Smith, as I mentioned in his book called Desiring the Kingdom, provides a lot of examples of answers people have given in contemporary culture and what he calls the secular practices that go along with those visions of good life, the things they do, right? He focuses, for instance, in his book on shopping and consuming as a widespread vision of the good life, right? And the kind of thrill of acquisition. He even points out that our malls have become kind of cathedrals, right? They have large, kind of vaulted openings and marble floors and walls. They have aesthetically pleasing kind of storefronts. If you've been in a European cathedral, they'll have chapels along the sides, and the kind of retail storefronts, once you're inside, are very much like those chapels along the side. That they don't have incense, but they have scents, right? And they even have hymns. Well, not quite hymns, but they're playing music. And then there's people gathering together, frequently on Sundays, right, to go shopping, processing through the entryways and gazing together at beautiful things. It's very much like a substitute for church. It's a vision of the good life. It's all in the architecture, the high ceilings, and the marketing is trying to give you a sense of transcendence, right? Bed, bath, and beyond, The point is, again, we're desiring creatures, right? Constantly on the hunt in malls or other places for more than just our physical needs, frequently people don't know what they're on the hunt for. C.S. Lewis is well known for discussing this feeling, this almost inconsolable longing of the human for that which we know not what, he says. But to describe it, he uses the German word, Sehnsucht. Yes, another German word this week, which is surprisingly since I have no German myself. Sehnsucht, which means longing, desire, yearning, or craving. Sehnsucht has elements of nostalgia, as if we felt something like this before, or maybe echoes of it, elements of joy, if we can imagine having it, but usually combined with the fact that it feels like life is missing something. Sehnsucht. What's missing? It was this feeling that led Lewis himself, a brilliant and at one time secular academic, on to reason that such a longing was there by design in us, designed to lead us to God himself. In his novel, Till We Have Faces, the heroine narrates, "It almost hurt me, this feeling. Like a bird in a cage, when other birds of its kind are flying home, I want to find the place where all the beauty comes from. My country, the place where I ought to have been born, the longing for home." And so we humans walk around with this desire for I don't know what. Desires which, of course, drive our economy as billion-dollar industries roll out 1,000 preoccupations for us, many of them good and enjoyable things, but which are very, very often dim reflections and sometimes flatly misleading dead-end directions for what we're desiring. But for the psalmist, the problem is not what to want. He knows what to want. He wants God. The problem is he's having trouble finding him. He can't find the water. He goes on to say, "My soul thirsts for God, for the living God." That would have been a reference to living streams of water that would run in Palestine regardless of the season of the year, even in the dry seasons. He longs for that living water. For the psalmist seems to be in a season of dryness. In a few weeks, we're going to look at Psalm 88, which is the driest of the dry psalms. And we'll have some more uplifting ones in between. And we'll talk about what do Christians do in seasons of dryness, seasons of felt absence. And of course, I say felt absence because, metaphysically speaking, there is no real absence of God. He is here. He is here. But sometimes it's hard to feel it. And the psalmist doesn't doubt he exists, or else he wouldn't even be writing a psalm at all. And it's good to recall at this point that, remember, these Psalms weren't private diary entries, not some singer-songwriter, writing emo songs in their room. No, these were actually designed for public worship. They were written for the Hebrew prayer book, the Hebrew songbook. They would sing songs like this, like, God, where are you? In their Sunday services, of course, for them Saturday. And many of these so-called Psalms of disorientation were written actually to normalize this experience, to say, actually, this happens. These feelings happen. And to give people vocabulary if they ever actually were to stumble upon this kind of season where you can't find the water. Instead, he tells us in verse 3, the only water he has is from his tears. And these he doesn't call water, but food. My tears have been my food day and night, while they, whoever they are, say to me all day long, where is your God? So there's a hint of loneliness here too, isn't there? No one around him actually seems to be sharing his belief or encouraging him or reinforcing him. It's likely, although we don't know for sure, that he's in some situation of exile or perhaps some illness. But in any case, there's a sense of isolation, of being alone in his desire for Yahweh. And they rub it in. Where is your God? Maybe we ourselves have actually sometimes felt this kind of lonely feeling of faith now in the modern era, right? And I was reminded last week by Israel that the philosopher Charles Taylor wonders how Western culture has journeyed from, say, the year 1500, when belief in God was common and unproblematic, to, say, the year 2000, when belief suddenly is just one option among many, and frequently not the easiest one for people to have. In his massive work, 700-page work called The Secular Age, Taylor tells a rich story of how we got to this point in culture through various key cultural changes that, of course, is too much to talk about today, but not the least of which was the cultural change into finding human significance only here, apart from God, and the consequent romance with humanism, our own powers and agency. He argues that it doesn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be this way, but it's become this way. And perhaps this is where we can relate to the psalmist, as you and I often live and move among others who find the idea of God, frankly, implausible. And they may be saying in some sense, where is your God? Perhaps not mockingly, but confused. But for the psalmist, this seems to only increase his desire for God. And we might, however, connect with him on the one hand. On the other hand, we might think to ourselves, I'm not quite that spiritual. I don't wake up every day with a desire for God. In fact, that desire even sounds a little bit abstract. What does the psalmist mean? What would it even look like to gain God? What does the psalmist think that he's lost temporarily or no longer feels? Well, you may recall in our study in Philippians in August and July, often called Paul's most encouraging, affectionate letter to the churches, where he writes from a Roman prison, by the way, not all is well, to a tiny minority culture who themselves, living in a Roman colony, were scorned for their belief. They pointing to Caesar and the monuments that were so clearly visible and concrete, asking, in some sense or another, where's your God? So to them, Paul writes this: finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Dwell on these things. Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you, he says. Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Why is that so? It's because in these things, too, there can be an experience of God. Not only in a direct relationship with God can we experience God's presence, but whatever we happen upon that is true, that is honorable, that is pure, that is lovely, that is commendable, that's excellent, anything worthy of praise. In other words, the desire for God that the psalmist has, the thirst, can be watered not by just some private experience with God, but also as we find the good and the true and the beautiful, wherever these may be, because they reflect that God is here. You and I are incarnational creatures. We have bodies, which means we take in things through the senses, which means also that we can take in echoes of God through the senses in what is good and true and beautiful. Signposts, if you will, not to a God who's far away, but as I said, as I opened, who's right here. Right here. It might be in some healing or reconciliation or unconditional love we see in a relationship around us. It might be the depiction in art or film or language for some good that we suddenly realize we long for that and was implanted there by God. In Anglicanism, we celebrate a sacramental theology. Sacraments not understood in the narrow sense of baptism and Eucharist, which are our major two sacraments. But generally, we believe that in concrete and visible things in the world, we can see God's presence, though they are not God themselves. Grandest of these surely is the beauty of the natural world, where we sense there is a God. And the subtlest could be some small act of sacrificial love we observe from one person to another. God is here. And it turns out, actually, that the psalmist is thinking of one of these things when he says, I thirst for God. He writes in verse 4, so these things I remember, he says, as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. He pulls this up from his memory. He says, I remember we used to go as a group on these pilgrimages to Jerusalem. That watered my soul. It turns out that these worship services in Israel were occasionally noisy and crowded affairs, and the psalmist loved it. It was being together, being carried by a communal group desire to enjoy God in prayer, in music, with food, with practices, in the beauty of the temple. As I've said before, I think humans were created to want to praise things. We want to glorify things. And again, the joy of sharing and posting in social media actually hits us right what we long for. To praise things together with other people. But the question is still, for humans, what do we praise? What can we glorify? Because if we could find things to really glorify, things that were really praiseworthy, and we could do it together, wow, that would meet us in our loneliness. A desire to look upon the good things together is often the basis of friendship. Two people looking on a third thing that brings them together. So in panting for God like the deer, the psalmist is looking for being together before God with others. Being together before God with others. Celebrating, gazing upon, tasting what is good and true and beautiful in him and in this world he created. What the psalmist seems to long for, when he longs for God, is, to put it kind of prosaically, church. Now I know for you, calling up memories of church may not always water your soul. And it would be unrealistic to suppose that the psalmist wasn't familiar with conflicts among the people of God, even in the temple, wounds that resulted from life together. But now he sure longs for it, for whatever reason he can't be there, whether it is exile or ill health or something else. And in fact, we've probably emerged from just such a time ourselves, right? A period of alienation when we weren't able to be together for the better part of a year or more, where all of us were prevented from joining the throng, the procession to the house of God. But for many of us, we get to be back. We get to sing together, we get to pray together, we get to eat together, walk down the aisles together to communion, to the Eucharist. You know, I've heard people say, and I've said it myself, that it's actually taking the Eucharist that when I miss church on any given Sunday, I most miss. Not someone like me talking. I miss taking the Eucharist together with people. I've heard people say that, and that's true to my experience, which is really strange because I didn't grow up in a liturgical Eucharistic church. I was your kind of non-denominational EV-free church guy, and I bless that. But now that's what I miss when I miss church. I miss joining the throng, coming before God. And again, there may be times even going to church when our experience of all these things feels kind of thin. When it's hard to praise, maybe hard to say the Apostle or the Nicene Creed and believe it all the way down. But the beauty of processing together to God, before God, is that it carries us. And I've heard people say that. That the liturgy, that the practices, that the prayers, we don't have to come and make this up. We get to enter in, and the liturgy, being together, carries us to God. We don't have to have it all together emotionally. We don't have to have it all together spiritually. We have our brothers and sisters to carry us, even carry our desire, if that should be thin. It's likely even in your own dry seasons, you remember a time like the psalmist does, times when God was palpably present to you in gatherings with the people of God. And these memories also can be a great sustenance in such dry times. It's a great gift to the psalmist who in verse 5 of now Psalm 43, Psalm 42 and 43 looks like they should have been one psalm. He writes, "Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me?" I love the way the psalmist does that. He talks to himself. He says, "Hope in God, for I can praise him, my salvation and my God, and I will again." The great gift of being among the people of God is letting them carry you into his presence and remembering that he has been there before. Like someone in a canoe who moves forward by looking backwards. Memory is a gift as well. So what are we invited to do in seasons of dryness and the disorientation? We're invited to join the people of God. Join the throng to continue possessing with each other, and if necessary, to be carried by them to the shepherd who leads his sheep to water. To echo last week's Psalm 95, in all seasons, but in particularly in dry ones, come let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our God, our Maker. For we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.